Welcome. Tonight we bring you one of the oldest questions in human thought. Does God exist? On one side, a scholar arguing from the Islamic tradition, drawing on the Quran, the Hadith literature, and centuries of Muslim philosophy. On the other, a philosopher arguing from the atheist tradition, drawing on modern science, logic, and Western philosophy of religion. Both speakers will present the strongest, most intellectually honest version of their position. Neither side will be strawmanned. Sources will be cited as we go, and every claim will be checked against the historical and textual record at the end of this program. This is a debate, not a sermon, and not a lecture. No winner will be declared. You, the listener, are the judge. Let's begin. Debater Introductions. Debater 1. The Islamic scholar trained in classical Islamic theology, Kalam, and comparative philosophy of religion, Debater 1 will argue that the existence of God, as described in the Quran, is the most rationally coherent explanation for the universe, for consciousness, and for morality. Debater 2. The atheist philosopher trained in analytic philosophy and the philosophy of science, Debater 2 will argue that naturalism, the view that only the physical universe exists without any God, better fits the evidence, and that theistic arguments fail on logical or evidential grounds.
Thank you. I want to begin not with faith, but with reason, because Islam has never asked anyone to believe blindly. The Quran itself repeatedly appeals to observation and reflection. In Surah Fusilat, it says, "We will show them our signs in the horizons and within themselves until it becomes clear to them that it is the truth." Surah Fusilat 41:53. This is an invitation to look outward at the cosmos and inward at ourselves, and to ask what best explains what we find. Start with the universe itself. Contemporary cosmology tells us the universe had a beginning, the Big Bang. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. This is the classical cosmological argument, developed rigorously in the Islamic tradition by philosophers like Al-Kindi and later Al-Ghazali, centuries before it entered Western philosophy. The cause of the universe must be outside space, time, matter, and energy, because it caused space, time, matter, and energy. It must therefore be timeless, spaceless, immaterial, and enormously powerful. This is not yet the God of Islam in full, but it is already a being with attributes remarkably close to how the Quran describes Allah. He is the first and the last, the ascendant and the intimate. Surah Al-Hadid 57:3. Second, consider fine-tuning. The physical constants of our universe, the strength of gravity, the cosmological constant, the ratio of electromagnetic to gravitational force, sit within an extraordinarily narrow range that permits stars, chemistry, and life to exist at all. Physicists across the spectrum, including many who are not religious, acknowledge this apparent fine-tuning as a genuine puzzle. Some resolve it by proposing a multiverse of unobservable universes. I would suggest that a single, purposeful cause is a simpler explanation, and Occam's razor should count in its favor rather than against it. Third, consider morality. Human beings across every culture treat certain acts, the gratuitous torture of a child, betrayal of trust, cruelty for its own sake, as really objectively wrong, not merely distasteful to us personally. If morality is simply a byproduct of evolution and social convention, it is difficult to explain why moral claims feel binding on us in a way that mere preferences like taste in food do not. The Islamic position is that objective moral values exist because they are grounded in the character and command of a real moral lawgiver. As the philosopher of religion Alvin Plantinga has argued, naturalism struggles to ground objective moral duties in a universe of blind physical processes. Fourth, consider the Quran itself as historical evidence. The text has been transmitted with a documented chain of memorization and written compilation from the 7th century onward, and Muslims argue its literary coherence, its preservation, and its claims about the past, such as the mummification and preservation of Pharaoh's body, referenced in Surah Yunus 1092, are worth serious historical engagement rather than dismissal. None of this constitutes an irrefutable logical proof. No argument for or against God's existence in the history of philosophy has achieved that. But cumulatively, the case for a transcendent, purposeful cause of the universe is, I will argue, more coherent and less costly in ad hoc assumptions than the alternative on offer tonight. I look forward to my colleague's response.
Thank you. I want to begin by agreeing with something my colleague said. Neither of us can offer an airtight logical proof tonight. What I can offer is the position that best fits the evidence we actually have, without smuggling in unexplained entities to patch the gaps in our knowledge. Take the cosmological argument first. Yes, the universe appears to have a finite past, as best current cosmology can tell, but whatever begins to exist has a cause is a principle we've only ever observed applying to things within the universe, objects made of pre-existing matter rearranging. We have no evidence this principle applies to the origin of space-time itself, since causation, as we understand it, presupposes time, and there was no before the Big Bang in the ordinary sense. As the philosopher Bertrand Russell put it in his famous 1948 BBC debate with Frederick Copleston, the universe may simply be, in his words, a brute fact. It may not require an external explanation at all. And even if it does, positing a cause tells us nothing about that cause's nature. Philosopher J.L. Mackie, in The Miracle of Theism, pointed out that jumping from the universe has a cause to the cause is a personal, all-powerful, morally interested being who wrote the Quran is an enormous, unjustified leap. At most, the argument gets you a mysterious first cause, not Allah, not Yahweh, not any specific religion's God. On fine-tuning, this is a genuinely interesting puzzle, and I won't dismiss it. But notice the reasoning is a probability argument compared against an unknown sample space. We have exactly one universe to observe, so we cannot calculate the odds of this universe against all possible universes the way we calculate the odds of a dice roll. Philosopher and atheist Graham Oppy has argued in detail that fine-tuning arguments rest on probability assumptions we're simply not entitled to make. And there's a deeper problem. Postulating an infinitely powerful, infinitely intelligent designer to explain a finely tuned universe doesn't reduce complexity, it multiplies it. As Richard Dawkins argues in The God Delusion, a designer capable of fine-tuning an entire universe would itself require an explanation at least as improbable as the thing it's meant to explain. Design arguments don't so much answer the question as relocate it. On morality, I don't accept that atheism cannot ground objective, binding moral concern. Human beings are social, empathetic primates who evolved in cooperative groups. Cruelty undermines cooperation and trust, and our moral intuitions track real facts about well-being and suffering. Sam Harris has argued in The Moral Landscape that morality can be understood as concerning the flourishing and suffering of conscious creatures, a domain we can investigate, reason about, and improve on without appeal to divine command. In fact, grounding morality in divine command creates its own classical problem, the Euthyphro Dilemma, first posed by Plato. Is an act good because God commands it, or does God command it because it is already good? If the former, morality becomes arbitrary, whatever God happens to say. If the latter, goodness exists independently of God, and we don't need God to explain it after all. On the Quran as evidence, textual preservation and internal coherence tell us about the transmission history of a text. They don't establish its supernatural origin. Every scripture, including texts we both agree are not divinely authored, can be transmitted carefully and read as internally coherent by its adherents. Finally, I'd invoke a general principle articulated by Christopher Hitchens. What can be asserted without sufficient evidence can also be dismissed without sufficient evidence. The burden of proof sits with the person proposing an additional, invisible, mind-like entity behind the universe, not with the person who withholds belief until the evidence is in. Naturalism isn't a competing faith with its own leap of proof. It's simply not adding an unproven entity where the natural world already offers a workable, if incomplete, account. I look forward to pressing these points further.
1. You said the universe may be a brute fact, needing no explanation. Isn't that itself an unfalsifiable assertion, no more scientific than positing a creator?
Debater 2. It's a modest position, not a positive claim. I'm not asserting the universe is definitely uncaused, only that we're not entitled to assume it needs a cause in the same sense objects within the universe do. The asymmetry is that I'm not adding a new entity, you are. You cited Al-Ghazali's cosmological argument, but Al-Ghazali also used a similar logic to argue against the very causal necessity that later Muslim philosophers like Ibn Rushd defended. Doesn't the internal disagreement among Islamic philosophers themselves suggest the argument is far from settled, even within your own tradition?
Debater 1. Disagreement among philosophers doesn't disprove an argument. Physicists disagree about quantum interpretation without abandoning physics. Al-Ghazali and Ibn Rushd disagreed about how causation works, not whether the universe requires an ultimate explanation. You appeal to evolution to explain moral intuition, but evolution selects for survival and reproduction, not for truth. If our moral sense is just a survival tool, why should we trust it to track anything objectively real rather than merely what helped our ancestors' genes propagate?
Debater 2. That's a fair challenge. This is sometimes called an evolutionary debunking argument, and philosophers on both sides take it seriously. My answer is that natural selection for cooperation plausibly tracks something real about what allows conscious beings to flourish or suffer, so the selection pressure and the truth can coincide, the way selection for accurate depth perception tracks real facts about distance. You quoted Quran 41:53 as an invitation to empirical reflection, but doesn't the Quran also contain claims that modern science has revised, or
I'd resist cherry-picking. I'm citing verses relevant to tonight's specific philosophical question, not claiming every verse is a scientific proof text. Muslim scholars have always distinguished between verses of clear legal or narrative purpose and verses inviting reflection on nature. That's not evasion, it's normal interpretive practice, the same way you wouldn't expect a philosophy paper to also be a chemistry textbook. You raised a Euthyphro Dilemma. But in classical Islamic theology, the answer is neither horn of the dilemma as Plato framed it. Goodness is not arbitrary, and it is not independent of God. It flows necessarily from God's unchanging nature, which is perfectly just and wise. Doesn't this third option dissolve the dilemma rather than fall into it? That relocates the dilemma rather than dissolving it. Now I'd ask, is God's nature good because it has the properties it has? In which case, those properties are what ground goodness, independent of who has them. If so, we're back to goodness being explicable without reference to God as such, only to certain properties, which a purely secular ethics can also try to identify and justify. You mentioned fine-tuning multiple times. Physicist and priest-adjacent debates aside, isn't it true that we don't actually know whether the physical constants could have been otherwise, or whether deeper yet undiscovered physical laws might necessitate the values we observe? The way we now know the freezing point of water isn't a tuned coincidence, but follows from molecular physics. That's possible, and I'll grant we don't have a final theory of everything. But positing unknown physical necessity we haven't discovered yet is itself a faith commitment about future science, no less speculative than positing a designer, and arguably it explains less, since it doesn't address why there should be elegant, life-permitting laws at all rather than none. If naturalism is true and consciousness is purely physical, how do you account for subjective experience, the what it is like to see the color red, from purely non-conscious matter? Isn't this the well-known hard problem of consciousness, which many secular philosophers admit remains unsolved? I agree it's unsolved, and philosophers like David Chalmers, who is not religious, take it very seriously. But an unsolved problem is not evidence for theism, unless theism actually explains consciousness better. And simply saying, God made it happen, doesn't give a mechanism either. It just stops the inquiry at an earlier point. Given how many different religions each claim exclusive revealed truth, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, with mutually incompatible claims, why should an outside observer conclude Islam specifically is correct, rather than concluding that religious conviction generally reflects culture and upbringing rather than a real, universally accessible revelation? The diversity of religious claims is a real challenge, and Muslim theologians take comparative religion seriously rather than dismissing it. The Quran itself acknowledges previous revelations to Jews and Christians. My case for Islam specifically rests on additional arguments about the Quran's preservation and content that we don't have time to fully develop tonight. But the existence of competing claims doesn't by itself refute the more general theistic case I opened with. You lean on Occam's razor to prefer naturalism as simpler. But isn't an account with no ultimate explanation for why anything exists at all, why there is something rather than nothing, actually a less complete and in that sense less economical theory than one that terminates in a necessary, self-explaining being? The why there is something rather than nothing is one of the hardest questions in philosophy, and I don't claim naturalism has a fully satisfying answer to it. But God doesn't obviously answer it either. You still have to explain why a necessarily existing God is more coherent than a necessarily existing universe or quantum vacuum, and simply asserting God is necessary while denying the universe could be necessary looks like special pleading, unless independently justified. Finally, if an all-powerful, all-loving God exists, why is there so much seemingly gratuitous suffering in the world, including the suffering of children who cannot benefit morally from it? Isn't this the classical problem of evil? And doesn't its persistence across millennia suggest theism carries an unresolved cost that naturalism does not? The problem of evil is the strongest objection to theism, and I won't minimize it. The Islamic response typically appeals to free will, to this life being a limited test rather than the whole story, and to the limits of human epistemic access to God's reasons. Arguments developed by theologians like Al-Ghazali and in the Western tradition, Alvin Plantinga's free will defense. I'd grant this doesn't remove all discomfort, but I'd argue it shows the existence of suffering is logically compatible with an all-powerful, all-good God, even if we can't always see why specifics occurs. My colleague's strongest move tonight was refusing to let the cosmological argument travel all the way to the God of the Quran, and instead insisting that, at most, it establishes an unspecified first cause. I accept that the cosmological argument alone doesn't identify which religion is correct. No single argument was ever meant to. But notice what's been conceded: a transcendent, timeless, spaceless, immensely powerful cause of the universe. That is already a remarkable concession for an atheist position to make, and it's a shorter distance from an immensely powerful, timeless first cause to theism broadly than from a purely random, self-existing multiverse to naturalism. On fine-tuning, my colleague argues we can't calculate probabilities with a sample size of one universe. But this cuts both ways. If we can't reason at all about the improbability of our universe's constants, then appeals to a hypothetical multiverse to dissolve the puzzle are equally unwarranted, since we have zero observational evidence for any other universe. A single, purposeful explanation requires one unobserved entity. A multiverse requires an unobserved, unfalsifiable, and unnecessarily vast machinery of universes. Between the two, I maintain a purposeful cause is the more economical option. On morality, my colleague's account, cooperative behavior tracks real facts about well-being, still doesn't explain why we're morally obligated to care about well-being in the first place, as opposed to merely finding it useful. Sam Harris's move from is to out has been challenged by philosophers on both religious and secular sides, going back to Hume's is-out problem. Without a transcendent ground, out claims risk collapsing into what promotes flourishing as I've defined it, which is a preference dressed as an obligation. And the problem of evil raised at the very end, I addressed it directly in cross-examination, and I'll simply add, the existence of moral evil actually presupposes a real objective moral standard by which suffering counts as bad. If naturalism is true and morality is a social construct, evil loses the force needed to make this argument work as a genuine objection, rather than a description of things we personally dislike. My colleague argues that conceding an immensely powerful, timeless first cause is a major concession towards theism. I'd push back. An impersonal cause, even a strange, timeless one, is compatible with countless non-theistic pictures of reality, including cyclical or quantum fluctuation models some cosmologists take seriously. Nothing about immense and timeless implies wills, judges, reveal scripture, and answers prayer. The distance from deism to a specific revealed religion with its specific legal and historical claims is enormous, and tonight's arguments haven't crossed it. On fine-tuning, I want to correct the framing. I did not argue we should believe in a multiverse. I argued that we should be humble about probability claims made from a single observed universe. That humility applies symmetrically, and it undercuts the fine-tuning argument for design at least as much as it undercuts any hypothetical multiverse hypothesis. My position doesn't require me to defend the multiverse. It only requires noting that improbable, therefore designed, is a weaker inference than it first appears. On morality, I'll grant that grounding out in is a genuine problem in philosophy. Hume identified it long before Harris. But theism doesn't escape this problem. It just relocates it one step further back, to God commands X, therefore we ought to do X, which needs its own bridging premise about why divine commands generate obligations unless one already presupposes the obligation to obey God, which is circular. On the problem of evil, my colleague appealed to free will and a test for this life. That response works reasonably well for human moral evil, suffering caused by human choices. It's far less effective for natural suffering with no human agent at all, a child dying from a genetic disease or in a natural disaster, where free will offers no explanation. This remains, I'd argue, the single heaviest piece of counter-evidence against the maximally good, maximally powerful God. And my colleagues' responses this evening were thoughtful and honest, but they narrowed it rather than removed it. Tonight I've tried to build a cumulative case, not a single knockdown proof. The universe began to exist and required a cause outside itself. Its physical constants sit in a narrow, life-permitting range. Human beings across cultures experience morality as binding, not merely preferential. And the Quran has offered across 14 centuries an invitation to examine the natural world as a form of revelation in itself. We will show them our signs in the horizons and within themselves until it becomes clear to them that it is the truth. Surah Fusilat 41:53. My colleague has raised real, serious challenges, the problem of evil chief among them, and I don't pretend the free will and greater context responses erase every discomfort a thoughtful person should feel about suffering in the world. But I'd ask you to weigh the whole picture, a worldview that has to treat the universe's beginning, its fine-tuning, the reality of consciousness, and the felt weight of moral obligation as four separate, unexplained brute facts against a worldview that offers a single, unifying explanation for all four, a necessary, transcendent, purposeful being. This is, in the end, an argument about which picture carries less unexplained cost. I've argued that theism, specifically the account given in the Quran of a single creator who reveals himself through both nature and scripture, does more explanatory work with fewer unexplained brute facts than naturalism does. I don't ask you to take this on faith alone tonight. I ask you to weigh the arguments as you would any other question of what best explains the evidence in front of us. Wake up early in the morning. Take a walk. Look in the mirror. Take a selfie. Consider your own interests. Take care of your sister. Tonight, I've argued for a more modest position than my colleagues. Not that we can prove God does not exist, but that the specific arguments offered for God's existence don't succeed, and that naturalism explains what we observe without needing an unobserved, mind-like cause behind it. The cosmological argument, even if sound, gets you an unspecified first cause, not the specific, personal, revelation-giving God of Islam or any other religion. The fine-tuning argument rests on probability judgments we're not well-positioned to make from a single observed universe. The moral argument assumes secular ethics can't ground objective concern for well-being, when, in fact, human empathy, reasoning, and cooperation offer a workable account without needing a divine lawgiver, one that also avoids the ancient Euthyphro problem entirely. And the problem of evil remains, in my view, the most serious weight on the theistic side tonight. Natural suffering with no human cause and no discernible greater purpose is difficult to reconcile with a being who is simultaneously all-powerful and perfectly loving. My colleagues' responses this evening were thoughtful and honest, but they narrowed the difficulty rather than removed it. I'd close with the principle articulated by Christopher Hitchens. Extraordinary, unfalsifiable claims about an unseen, mind-like creator of the universe require extraordinary evidence, and the burden of proof properly sits with the person making the positive claim. Naturalism isn't a leap of faith of equal size. It's simply declining to add an entity the evidence doesn't require. I'd ask you to weigh tonight's arguments on their merits, not on the comfort or discomfort either conclusion produces, and to notice which side had to invoke fewer unproven premises to explain what we actually observe.